Yeah, sorry, it's just dawning on me that I've agreed to give a talk discussing romance scenes I've written to a room full of strangers. My name is James Chu. I'm a senior writer at Failbetter Games. I was going to put my Twitter handle there, but things happened. Who here is familiar with Fall in London, Some of the Sea or Some of the Skies? Okay, so most of you know who we are. For those of you who don't, we're kind of an indie studio who specialize in narrative games set in a kind of Victorian Gothic universe. Kind of Desire has been a design element across several of our titles, and we're doing a kind of visual novel coming out soon in which it's very much foregrounded as an element. Before we begin, I would like to define desire, which I'm sure I can do in 20 seconds or less. In this talk, I'll be using kind of two definitions of desire. One is desire as kind of a narrative element. That is kind of something that can be experienced in your game, whether as a theme or as something the player experiences, romance, encounters, scenes of intimacy and desire, and so on. The other type of desire is as a player motivation. What a player is interested in, how will they engage with kind of desire in your game, what do they want to experience. Obviously, as you're designing a game, you need to be thinking about both forms when designing scenes for desire in your title. I'm also going to be talking about genre, affordance, and how that might shape what desire looks like, its expressions in your title. Looking at player agency and consent, desire as kind of an expressive tool for the player to express kind of motivations and identity. Non-player character agency and how to kind of make non-player characters feel like they have agency within the context of being subjects of player desire. And kind of unusual romance encounters, by which I mostly mean smooching monsters. To explain what I mean by kind of how genre and the shape of your game will kind of influence what desire and scenes of desire look like within your game, I've got a few examples from some of our titles. Fall in London is a browser game. It's been running for sort of 12 years, 13 in January. It's kind of got a huge amount of stories within it. There is a single protagonist moving through the game, experiencing all these different stories. It's got a cast of thousands. Some characters recur, but often it takes a while for you to see a character again. Because of kind of the narrative complexity and the scope of the game, opportunities for desire crop up. It's a thematic element, but they tend to be kind of rare one-offs, surprise encounters. They're kind of the exception, not the norm. It is possible for the player to express an intention towards a particular character in the game by kind of making them, we call it kind of a spouse, you can marry, but that's kind of sort of a blanket term that covers a range of relationships, platonic, polyamorous, and so on. And different characters can kind of qualify for becoming the player's spouse in the game. Because of kind of the narrative scope of the game, it wouldn't make sense for us to assume that this character or characters are always present with the protagonist. And often it doesn't make narrative sense for them to be so. So it's kind of a tool that we use to signify a relationship, allow the player to express a romantic or kind of intimate or otherwise kind of relationship with a particular character that they want recognized by the game, that we can call back to occasionally. But it's not something that has kind of a major kind of narrative role within the game because of the scope. We are a live game, which means that we can respond to collective player desire, which is when kind of players kind of write to us on Discord, Reddit, Tumblr, and so on, expressing kind of, oh, this character has a really cool backstory, we want to know more, or more often, he's got tentacles, he's hot. We can respond to that by kind of introducing them and including them in kind of storylines, potentially adding them as a spouse item, and so on. But fundamentally, kind of Fall in London isn't designed for kind of long-term relationship exploration. It just competes with too many other narrative elements. We do kind of use it as a kind of tool for player expression. There is one particular storyline where the player is having to establish a reputation at Queen Victoria's court and then immediately get banished because the life of the Fall in London protagonist is a complicated one. As part of this storyline, they kind of have to build up kind of a relationship with kind of two tastemakers at court. At the end of this kind of quite significant narrative arc, the player is given a choice of how they wish to be banished. If they've got sufficient cachet with both characters, they can ask them essentially for a threesome on Queen Victoria's throne. This isn't really kind of intended as kind of an in-depth exploration of the relationship between these two characters or them and the protagonist. It's a moment for the player to be asked, what kind of character are you? Is this the kind of hedonism, audacity that your character represents? If so, please proceed with our kind of full support. So it's a moment to kind of reflect on who you are as a character. In Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies, however, by contrast, these are narrative roguelikes. As that implies, the protagonist can die, which is something of a blocker for kind of long-term relationship development. It feels weird if a character immediately picks up kind of the thread with a new player character. It's also kind of very much embedded in kind of loneliness, darkness, cosmic horror as themes, and the basic kind of gameplay loop is the player going out into the darkness, coming back to the port, and kind of stories of brief moments of warmth within that wider darkness. As such, there aren't many recurring characters, because the player is out kind of uncovering new story threads all of the time. There is a kind of crew of officers who can join you on your ship or space train in Sunless Skies because it's in space. But they tend to be kind of quite tortured souls themselves. They're there to kind of reflect the themes of the game, develop kind of particular world building, and so often they can end up in states which make them unsuitable for romance, shall we say. So we tend to kind of have brief encounters to kind of characterize them a little bit, allow kind of the player to express things about their player character in doing so. We made this guy romanceable very briefly. He is a very curmudgeonly character who can kind of hook up with the player very briefly aboard your space train. But fundamentally, he's not interested in anything long-term. His kind of story arc is him building a mechanical companion, which he will inevitably like more than you. So he's not really in this for the long term. So basically, kind of the basic kind of loop of the game, and also the way that we present text, we tend not to interrupt the player with kind of large amounts of text while they're out at sea or in this darkness of space, except for kind of important narrative moments. And so having kind of a recurring romantic relationship kind of intimately explored would feel jarring, and it would unbalance kind of the narrative elements of the game. Mask of the Rose, by contrast, is a visual novel. It carries with it certain genre expectations. You're playing a single character with kind of a small cast who recur from start to finish of the story. Conversation is its primary mechanic, which means there is room and scope for the player to kind of interact with on a kind of more intimate level, kind of have different kind of relationships with the characters in the game as they do so. And the expectation is that the player can experience different narrative arcs, and different approaches to different characters will change up the experience in doing so. It's also something where the sorry, lost my thread a little. It's also something where the kind of the game is oriented towards kind of romance as a thematic element, which kind of instructs the player in a way what kind of experiences are available and how to negotiate this space. So it is kind of built in and embedded in the design principles and the space of the game. And when the player is making choices within the game on a moment-to-moment level, they're choosing who to spend time with, and therefore who they're not spending time with, and they're expressing an intent to the game that this is a narrative arc I'm interested in and want to see to its conclusion. So kind of the different kind of contexts of different games shape what you have room for, and also kind of where and how those scenes manifest within the game itself, changing up kind of how desire kind of looks like, what opportunities the player has to explore in the game. All that being said, if players aren't interested in this content to begin with, if they're not motivated to explore it, if they're not aware it's present, or they've not consented to engage in it, then this kind of work is somewhat fruitless. Ideally, you don't really want to kind of be putting the player in a situation where they're experiencing romantic content that they hadn't expressed an interest in. No one wants to be Commander Shepard saying hello to a subordinate and then finding yourself sat on a countertop, swinging your legs and asking Jacob Taylor how his day's going. We had a moment of that in Sunless Skies when we launched in early access. This handsome chap is the Repentant Devil. That's a literal devil. That's a thing in our setting. He was one of the officers, and one of the only officers available in our early access build. He was a romance option because look at him. We thought people would want to hook up with him. But we kind of decided based on his personality that he was someone who would, again, be quite a fleeting encounter. He wouldn't kind of have any requirements for it. The upshot of this was that players were kind of going in, recruiting him, clicking on him, immediately selecting kind of the seduction option, and then getting cross because they found themselves in a relationship they hadn't expected to be. So we kind of got quite a few angry complaints on our forums about us making our players gay in space, which had we intended to do would have been fine. But it kind of spoke to kind of a wider mismatch where players were kind of mistrusting our ability to effectively signal to them the kind of consequences of actions that they'd taken. And so we kind of realigned how we were approaching this encounter. We kind of gated it by how much progress you'd made with his storyline, so it wasn't the first thing that would come up. You would have to have kind of invested in him a little to even see it, and hopefully that was training the player to kind of get used to kind of reading text when interacting with these officers and the basic kind of exploration and conversation loop in doing so. My suggestion that all romance options should kind of say awooga when you hover over them was not taken forward for some reason, but we did add the word carnal, making sure that as much as possible this option was visible as what it actually ended up being. And this was also to make sure that players who wanted to experience it could find it, and those who wanted to kind of knock boots with the devil in a rusting tin can in space could do so to their heart's content, whereas those who didn't want to experience that content would not. But it kind of speaks to a kind of wider problem because kind of romantic, intimate content is in such a kind of charged and such a kind of emotional subject matter, we have to handle it with more care than other potential narrative elements in a game. We also kind of, particularly in kind of narrative games, particularly in role-playing games, the link between protagonist and the player themselves kind of tends to be kind of closer than other narrative elements. And so if the game kind of inadvertently overrides kind of the integrity of the player character by kind of putting them in a situation, a romantic situation they hadn't intended to be, that can provoke kind of distrust in that game's ability to signal itself effectively. It can kind of jar, and in some cases it can actually provoke emotional distress. So kind of effective signaling and being very clear about kind of what options actually do is important. It's something that we have more scope for in Mask of the Rose because it is such a central element of the design from the outset. We kind of co-author the protagonist from the outset of the game. We do this when the player is kind of choosing their character creation. They're choosing their background, they're choosing their personality traits, they're choosing their presentation. They're also being asked, what are you interested in, what are you looking for? And they've got these 4 options, attraction here meaning kind of sexual attraction. And this kind of signals a few things. One, it signals to the game to gate options based on this choice. So players who haven't opted into kind of romantic or sexual content won't have options to flirt in their dialogue options, that just won't come up. Likewise, other characters in the game won't flirt with you if you've not consented to it at the outset here. This is something that kind of both signals to the player the type of experience they can have. It allows them to sort of co-author their experience with us. Hopefully it also signals to the player that they have control over the type of experience that they're going to have in the game, and hopefully kind of alleviates anxieties about those kind of potential mismatches from occurring. This being said, we don't want to effectively ruin the surprise of different pairings. Some of the fun of a visual novel is finding kind of different character options, seeing kind of different possibilities within the game, experiencing kind of different narrative arcs and seeing how the game can change. Based on that and kind of characters who might not be potentially interested in you in one build, might be in kind of a different playthrough. So we take what I call a cascade approach in Mask of the Rose, where kind of players are signaling to characters they're interested in some kind of form of intimacy, but this kind of doesn't lock them in. You have to kind of signal repeatedly to a character. We're using kind of Inkle's Ink scripting, and Emily Short, our creative director, has designed kind of a complicated system whereby non-player characters in the game can learn information in the same way that the player can. They can retain information and recall information. So when the player is kind of signaling interest, they remember. And after a kind of few instances, we'll often ask the player for clarification. Is this what you're interested in? Are you sure? And then the player can kind of proceed accordingly or kind of deny that. They can change their mind, of course, but because non-player characters can remember information, that might have narrative consequences. But the upshot is that kind of this de-emphasizes the importance of any single narrative choice in the game. You're not locked in immediately. And it's something that kind of the genre affords because there is that runway, because it's kind of a conversation-based game, and because relationship building is such a core part of kind of the narrative spine of the game. And this extends to kind of how players use desire as a tool of agency and kind of how different games might shape what there is room for. In Mask of the Rose, from the outset where you're being asked those questions, the player's kind of got kind of intimacy, relationships of one sort or another on their mind, that this is kind of a central aspect of the game. And so as they're playing through, they'll be thinking about, well, what do I mean to different characters? What do they mean to me? Do my kind of opinions change? Does my idea of what my character is, who they are, what their interests are, and what the motivation is change through kind of play, through discovery, and through kind of experiencing kind of narrative desire through interactions with other characters. In contrast, something like Some of the Sea or Some of the Skies, where those options are more fleeting, that tends to be more kind of giving the opportunity for the player to make a statement about their character, that this is who I am, this is kind of my orientation, this is my identity, or this is the character that interests me most. Because these options are fleeting, they tend to kind of be higher stakes. They tend to be all in, as it were, in terms of kind of relationship progression is established in kind of just one narrative beat, whereas it can play out more naturally in something like Mask of the Rose, which has that runway. But again, kind of even those expressions, those simple expressions of identity and motivation are something that players can then use to kind of build their profile of their character and then internally motivate how they approach the rest of the game with this kind of implicit narrative motivation extending from expressing desire in the moments that the game allows them to. In both instances, the player is kind of taking cues from the narrative and co-authoring their experience, co-authoring their idea of their protagonist with the game as they do so. But its power kind of derives from the player making conscious choices about what they're interested in, who they're interested in, and how they're interested. All that said, none of this, a world in which kind of the game just kind of reflects and acts as a mirror to the player desires without kind of pushback, without kind of critique, without kind of risk or tension, feels quite flat, it feels unempathetic as game design, and it feels solipsistic as an approach to designing desire particularly. And this is also kind of true of how we design desire. It's the anticipation of desire, the fun of introducing and including desire in games is not just the anticipation of it being fulfilled, but also the possibility of it being thwarted, that sense of tension, that sense of risk, that sense that the player might not get what they want. And that's something where character agency comes in and designing for characters who can push back, who can continue to maintain their agency despite being the subject of the player's kind of desire. And that's something that kind of we aim to design for and use as a design tool is kind of developing a sense of character agency within our games. But how do we actually do that? This is our first hot priest of the talk. He is not our last. This, I should say I did design him before Fleabag. He is the intrepid deacon. He is from one of our Fall in London exceptional stories, which are like subscriber stories. That kind of already establishes a context for how the player will interact with him, because these stories tend to be one-off. The characters within them don't recur. So that kind of stories pattern already sets expectations that this character might be briefly attainable, but ultimately isn't a long-term opportunity or a long-term kind of relationship for the player. Within the story himself, he is able to kind of override the player's kind of motivations. It's not a story about romancing him specifically. He's quite a bad priest. He is tempted by hell. Hell is a literal place in the setting, so that's less abstract than it might sound. And with his journey with the player can kind of lead him to a few different endings based on both what the player shows him, but also he has an internal motivation, an internal mechanic, which kind of might lead him to kind of different places within the choices the player makes. Within the context of this story, however, he can be briefly romanced. There is a kind of lull in the narrative where the player and the deacon are on a train to hell together. And this seems like a good opportunity in which you can romance him if you want. Or he can kind of like, you can get some lore, do some world building, but we found most players decided to romance the deacon given the chance. We had kind of established kind of as a narrative decision that he would probably be expressing interest in the player regardless, and we assumed that he was interested from the outset. However, even within this context, the player has to pass kind of a skill check in order to seduce him on a train. We figured he would have some kind of baseline resistance to hooking up in a train compartment. This was just kind of to allow for kind of the introduction of the possibility of him saying no, to give him that kind of sense of agency on a very simplistic, mechanical level. All that said, even if you do seduce him, it doesn't change the ending. It might kind of inflect it, it might kind of change a couple lines of dialogue, but it's not a determining factor. It will kind of make it a little more bittersweet, but it won't change the player outcome. In Mask of the Rose, however, we have kind of more opportunity and more kind of design tools in which to kind of simulate that sense of character agency. This is kind of through the NPC knowledge system I was explaining earlier, but also we have kind of a personality profile system, which extends to the player as well at character creation. The personality that they choose for themselves, the traits, the background they choose. An aristocrat might move through the game differently to a housebreaker, or an academic, therefore. And also the way you dress can change up what dialogue options you have. So how you interact with people will be very determined by the personality you've built for your character. Likewise, non-player characters in the game have different responses to different kind of player build-outs. And they have preferences, they have ways like being approached, they have kind of norms and values they prefer to see upheld. Depending on the player's relationship with them, however, they might be willing to kind of accept behaviors, statements, interactions, if the player's got kind of a good rapport with them that they might not otherwise have. Likewise, in the game, different characters can undergo value shifts, so their kind of preferred interactions might change as a result of kind of the narrative arcs they undergo. But kind of the basic design goal, and hopefully how it is experienced, is that the player character feels like a distinct presence in the game. And so do kind of the characters, when the player interacts with them, feel kind of like distinct personalities bouncing off each other. When we're kind of designing romance scenes in Mask of the Rose, we're considering kind of that sense of kind of two personalities interacting as core to how we design the scenes. And also the fact that we are catering for different types of kind of player motivations for approaching the scene, whether they're platonic, romantic, sexual, or some combination of the above. So we're kind of trying to design different routes through each intimate encounter with a particular character. We're also looking to do two things in this scene. One is to kind of lean into and ask ourselves what a player is interested in about this particular character, what excites them, what might interest them, what elements, what traits should we kind of emphasize in this scene. But we're also kind of trying to show, well, what haven't we shown about this character before? This can be kind of like big lore reveals, or it can be more small details that we can kind of reveal about them because the player is seeing them in a new context. And so kind of all of those elements together kind of shape how those scenes play out. This is our second hot priest of the talk. His name is Reginald. He's the Bishop of Southwark in Fallen London. Fallen London is set after Mask of the Rose, which already kind of establishes some constraints on approaching this character, because some players will be aware he has a future history that the game needs to line up with. But for characters who don't know that, we kind of need to emphasize that he is ultimately got different goals to the player and ultimately is not a long-term relationship. Within the context of the game itself, he is quite a conflicted character. He's kind of a very kind of blustery Anglican priest who's finding himself kind of being dragged under the ground by bats. He's also wrestling with the fact he's got quite an intense relationship with a fellow priest who's gone missing. And so a lot of his kind of arc is about him kind of negotiating the fact that kind of his worldview and his values don't really stack up with the world as he's finding it, and whether or not he comes to terms with that is sort of the question around the character. So when he approaches the player kind of while looking for Michael, the other priest, the player can kind of take that scene in multiple ways, depending on the relationship with Reginald and depending on Reginald's opinion of the player. But we knew this was going to be kind of a scene that could potentially be romantic, but we didn't want to locate it entirely in kind of tragedy or kind of melancholy. We also wanted to make it fun and lean into kind of the elements of the character that we thought players might want to experience. In Fallen London, you can wrestle the Bishop of Southwark. It's a joke moment, but we kind of wanted to play with it here and kind of take the scene potentially out of tragedy or making it too heavy emotionally from the outset. And we also wanted it to establish the relationship that he has clearly with Michael. So he tells the player that they wrestle together, and the subtext is what the subtext is. But when he introduces it to the player as, "I would also like to wrestle with you," he appears like so. You can thank Paul, our art director, for that. It kind of changes the scene. It kind of is still, at this moment, it can still be platonic. The player can kind of just treat it as a wrestling match, or they can kind of move the scene into a more intimate arena. But in so doing, it's kind of changing up the values of the scene to something hopefully kind of humorous and funny and a little bit shocking, as well as kind of introducing that core kind of narrative arc and reminding the player that ultimately his priority and his relationship with Michael is kind of stronger and weirder than what he will have with you. And however the scene plays out, he will leave the player in the morning and not come back. Slight spoilers, but the kind of implication is that it's not you, it's him, but he means a different him altogether. The second scene I wanted to talk about briefly is the Clay Lodger. He was one of our Kickstarter stretch goals, or better known as Moss under Limestone in the game. He's a clay man, which is a thing in our universe. Basically means kind of a living statue. He comes from a place where everything is screaming all of the time, but he's quite chill. His arc is, again, he's got kind of a complicated romantic connection, always kind of trying to figure out who he is as a character in his own right. He's never been in London before, he's never been on his own before, so he's establishing his own identity, and neither of his potential narrative endings orient him towards the player. But that said, he can develop quite an intimate relationship with the player. The player can kind of be sort of his guide, his kind of sounding board. He's quite a curious character anyway. So he kind of figured there would be kind of an opportunity to kind of become more intimate with him and kind of lean into kind of that curiosity. But given he's a statue, that did present certain kind of challenges to how we wrote and envisaged a scene of physical intimacy with the player. We kind of decided to kind of really lean into kind of those challenges and make a virtue of the fact that he's made of stone. So in kind of like a more chaste version of the scene, where the player, well, he either introduces the idea of kissing the player or the player can introduce the idea to him. He's curious, he's never experienced this before, but a basic kind of line for him is, if you've ever seen like statues in Catholic churches that have undergone object veneration, where they've been kissed, and then that kind of erodes them. That's something we thought, well, that's something he might actually be worried about, that if he's kissed too often, his lips will cease to be lips. So we kind of leaned into that as kind of a constraint on the scene, as kind of something he will present to the player as, I'm giving this to you, but this is kind of such a rare thing, this is a gift. And kind of emphasizing that this is a one-off experience for him. Likewise, if the scene becomes more intimate, he will kind of be quite blunt with the player that nothing physical can happen between them because he will probably kill the player in doing so. However, he does acknowledge he's an attractive statue. He's modeled after his king in the city he comes from, and he's happy for the player to kind of look at him and satisfy their desire, as it were, in front of him while he watches, which we hope is quite a kind of shocking scene. But we also hope, like, it's meant to be funny, it's meant to be kind of shocking and leaning into that constraint, that kind of slight sense of voyeurism and object worship, that kind of the themes of which are already sort of subtext in any relationship that you're trying to have with a man who is a statue. But we hope that kind of given how clear he is about his interest, about his curiosity, how it kind of, the honesty in which he kind of phrases this and expresses it, and the respect he has for the player, kind of shift it from kind of being a shocking, humorous moment to something a little bit more tender. It is undergoing that kind of tonal shift within the scene itself. So we're not shying away from kind of the comic aspects of hooking up with a priest or tangling with a statue, but we're hoping to go somewhere a little bit deeper and kind of explore the specific nature of the connection that those characters have with the player. I think I'm just going to wrap up and say that kind of desire as a narrative element carries more weight than potentially other elements in your game. If it's one element among many, it might stand out more because of its role in kind of identity formation and potentially as a motivation tool for the player. What you have room for and what it looks like will kind of look differently based on kind of the constraints of the scene, the shape of it, and where it appears in the game will kind of change up what you have room for and what makes sense to explore. Communicating with the player is paramount for the player to have an enjoyable experience and experience the content in the way that you would hope to, not kind of stumbling into it or finding it kind of being imposed upon them. When writing these scenes, it's important you kind of remember and consider the agency of all characters and the specific personality traits of all of them, and ensure that the scene feels as much as possible like a dialogue between both characters, because ultimately kind of desire in games is a lens that looks both ways. Thank you very much. I think that's all I've got time for.